and gentlemen, right on time, the Minister has arrived, so I just wanted to, by way of very brief introduction, ask Minister Thistlethwaite to come up and address us, but just a short introduction if you'll indulge me for a moment, Minister. So a distinguished public life already, currently the Assistant Minister for Defence, Assistant Minister for Veterans Affairs and also for the Republic. As a senator, he served in the Gillard-Rudd governments in 2011 to 13. He was the parliamentary secretary for, excuse me for a moment here, my terrible writing, for Pacific Island Affairs, that's right. Parliamentary secretary for Information, Infrastructure and Transport, and Parliamentary Secretary for Multicultural Affairs. He entered Parliament again, I suppose, in the lower house as the member for Kingsford Smith in the 2013 election, when I think Mr Garrett retired, if I'm not mistaken, and has held that seat since then. Before entering Parliament, he was the General Secretary of the New South Wales branch of the ALP, whose national conference is on at the moment, of course. So we're very appreciative of you being able to tear yourself away from that and make it here. Born in Sydney, grew up around Maroubra, as I said, very much a Sydney boy and holding the seat of Kingsford Smith since 2013. I also note that aside from parliamentary and public life, he also spent 4 years as the president of the Maroubra Surf Lifesaving Club. And having a little bit of experience with voluntary organisations myself, I wonder which has been the more challenging in terms of parliamentary secretary or the state secretary of the Labor Party or the Surf Lifesaving Club. But I dare say it's all made a contribution. Minister, we're very gratified that you can join us today. As I said, we are very conscious of your competing demands, and it's great to have you with us and address the conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everyone. I can tell you, having spent 3 days at a Labor Party national conference, it's a joy to be here with you this morning. And I want to acknowledge Brigadier Michael Arnett, the President of the Defence Reserve Association, Chief of the Australian Defence Force, General Campbell, my parliamentary colleague, Luke Howarth, senior leaders of the Australian Defence Force. Wonderful to see Paul Brereton here. Paul, of course, has recently been appointed as the chair of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, and I'm sure will do a wonderful job in that role. We've got distinguished guests, including Major General Mark Overton from the United Kingdom, who will be attending remotely, and friends, one and all. One of the greatest joys of my job is travelling around the country and visiting some of our defence bases and getting to talk to the wonderful personnel. And recently I was up at Gallipoli Barracks here for the National Employer Support Awards. And I was there to acknowledge and recognise the great work of those employers who've gone above and beyond to support the reservists in their workforce. And it was terrific to see the current generation of reservists mingling together on a base that boasts such a strong history of our reserve service. And today we face new challenges, and we know that our great reservists will respond to that challenge. When the Albanese Labor government came to office, we made a commitment to examine how Australia can best shape our Defence Force for the very different strategic environment that we now face. And the Independent Defence Strategic Review found that the strategic challenges outlined in Australia's 2020 Defence Strategic Update continue to accelerate. We see increasing competition economically, militarily, strategically and diplomatically, alongside that contest for values and narratives. And we see tensions and reduced warning times contributing to the risk of military escalation or miscalculation. The impact of climate change is now amplifying these challenges in ways that our reserve forces have directly faced. The government's response to the review sets out a blueprint for Australia's strategic policy, defence planning and resourcing over the coming decades. And to achieve everything we need to achieve, defence will need more people with the right skills in the right places. And we know that we have some workforce challenges when it comes to our Defence Force. So we're working across the board at pace in a spirit of partnership to make and deliver a new, innovative and bold approach to recruitment and retention and the rapid upskilling of the defence workforce. Importantly, we see the Defence Strategic Review as a blueprint for the way forward for our nation with defence. And a lot of the commentary about the DSR has been on kit and capability, and you would have read all of the commentary and the focus that's been around that document. But really, I think that what's been underscored is that our most important capability is our people. And the best equipment in the world can't operate without them. So we're reforming our approach to recruitment and looking at new ways to attract more people, particularly young Australians, to the full-time military and the reserves as well. And I think we need to look at new approaches to explain the breadth and depth of opportunities, diverse as they are within the Australian military, for people into the future. So not only is being a member of the reserves or the Australian Defence Force about looking at frontline combat roles, but importantly, how do we attract and encourage kids that are interested in computer coding or engineering or science and different approaches to see a career in the Australian Defence Force as one that is rewarding and challenging and doing something that is great for our nation. So we're focused on enabling our people to fulfil their career aspirations in a professional and supportive environment so that defence is a place that people can choose and that they can have a rewarding and fulfilling career in. And we're focused on supporting our people with great initiatives like expanding the Defence Home Ownership Assistance Scheme, halving the qualifying period for reservists from 8 years to 4 years. We've launched a review into defence housing and its adequacy moving forward, whether it's meeting the needs of Australian Defence Force members and their families, and that review has recently kicked off as well. And we'd certainly welcome any of your ideas about how we can make a career in the Australian Defence Force Reserves more attractive to more Australians. We're acutely aware that around a third of the ADF is made up of reservists, and that reserves span across all three services and is made up of professional and people from diverse backgrounds. From students who provide reserve service while studying, to members who've transferred from the permanent force and are continuing to provide part-time service, to specialist reserves like medical doctors and nurses, just to name a few. Some are self-employed in their civilian life, some work for large and small businesses, some work for government organisations. They come from all cultural backgrounds, varying age, gender, ethnicity and family composition. What they have in common is a desire to serve Australia. And we recognise that we're highly dependent on this level of commitment, and that we not only need to maintain the reserves, but we need to grow your ranks into the future. And we need to evolve the reserves in a new range of highly skilled fields. The government recognises the significant commitment that reserves have provided in recent operations, particularly in response to natural disasters throughout Australia, such as bushfire assist in 1920, COVID-19 support, and the many operations overseas. To take just one example, of the 6,500 defence members that provided support during Operation Bushfire Assist, 3,000 of those were reservists. There's an increased demand on the ADF to support domestic operations as we experience more frequent, intense, concurrent and compounding disasters. And as climate change makes natural disasters more frequent and more severe, we need to think differently about how we respond as a nation. And on behalf of the government, I want to sincerely thank you for the role that you played in assisting communities to recover from natural disasters that we've encountered in Australia over recent years. You can see it in the faces of the populations that you assist, the relief that they see when the trusty green uniform rolls into town to assist in that recovery. But we know that's not what you sign up for. And we certainly appreciate that that's not your primary role, nor should it be. And that's why we're looking at new ways to ensure that we take some of that pressure off our reserves and find other ways to provide that much needed support to communities moving forward. So earlier this month, the Minister for Emergency Management, Senator Murray Watt, launched a consultation process to investigate alternative solutions to simply drawing on ADF resources for natural disaster recovery in the future. It's not about removing defence from the disaster response. Where disaster strikes and defence has a unique capability to bring to bear, Australians can count that you'll be there. But in line with the Defence Strategic Review, the government's focused on making sure that defence is not the first call that's made, it's the last. And work's underway to broaden the nation's capacity when disaster strikes, including through a $38 million commitment in the recent budget to Disaster Relief Australia. This is a veterans-led organisation that provides additional support for states and territories when disaster occurs. And veterans, of course, and indeed reservists and ADF personnel, develop unique skills and capabilities during your service in the Australian Defence Force. Leadership qualities, logistical qualities, management qualities that are all highly valued in disaster recovery scenarios. And Disaster Relief Australia harnesses those skills that are developed during a person's life in the ADF and puts them to good use in a volunteer organisation when disaster occurs into the future. But we need to be honest that there are many challenges ahead for Defence and the reserves. I spoke about some of these larger themes last year when I delivered a speech to the Royal New South Wales Regiment. And one of the main recommendations of the Defence Strategic Review accepted by the government was for a review of the reserves. And the government's now looking forward to the recommendations that come from that review so that we can ensure that the reserve has a credible capability for the strategic environment that we face into the future, and to ensure that the reserve service meets the demands of its members as well. The broader workforce is changing, people's expectations are changing, and we need to change with them to ensure that the reserve remains a flexible form of service that people want to start and where they want to stay. And the program for this conference, I've had a look through, is diverse and challenging. You're tackling the biggest issues confronting the reserve service today. And I ask you to be bold and decisive in your deliberations in the strategic environment that our nation faces. We look forward to the recommendations and the dialogue that comes from your conference today, and I certainly look forward to working with the reserves to ensure that we build a stronger and more capable Australian Defence Force into the future. So thank you very much for having me this morning, and I'm happy to take a few questions before the other speakers start if you wish. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. We're very much encouraged by those comments, and just before you arrived, I was highlighting that our core objective, one of our two, is to explore and make a collegiate and positive contribution contribution to the discussion around how the part-time component of the ADF can be optimised to meet those national defence imperatives of the DSR. So we will be making a submission to the Strategic Reserve Review, and I know that will fall on fertile ground.
Great.
We do have some online questions as well. I'll curate those from here.
Oh, wow.
Yes, we do have technology.
Yeah.
We're really appreciative of the fact that you can stay for a little while and take some questions. So
Yeah,
thank you
no
very
worries.
much for your address.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Questions? I'll start from the floor before I go to Slido. Peter.
Peter Elgman.
We do have roving mics. I should have mentioned that earlier on. Sorry.
Peter Alchemade from Victoria. One of the challenges for the reserve and challenges for the ADF is accessing the skills that Defence are going to need now and, more importantly, in the future. To my mind, one of the current challenges is dealing with the fact that we, as a nation, we have a very small skills base in a very small population. Once the role of a reserve was simply to mobilise and provide soldiers for the combat, and Australia did indeed do that very well. However, the real challenge is being able to find and extract from the community the expertise that are needed now in peace and prospectively in war. And to my mind, the reserve should be the channel for doing that. Would you like to comment on that, sir?
Yeah, I agree with you, particularly in the current situation where we've got a very, very tight labour market and demand for skills is quite high, and that's why we've got a very low unemployment rate at the moment. Employers are crying out for people that have particular skills in certain occupations, and the government's attempting to deal with that in the longer term through a trades initiative. We've established an organisation called Jobs and Skills Australia, which is a tripartite organisation, government, employers and the union movement sitting down and trying to forecast, if you like, where the skills of the future are going to be needed and how we tailor the education system and work with employers to meet those challenges into the future. And I think that Defence is not immune from that as well. Defence is competing in that tight labour market as well, and we're going to need to make sure that we've got a good offering and that we're explaining to people. I think that Defence can do a better job of explaining to people the breadth and depth of roles that there are in the Australian military. And I've got to say, I don't come from a defence background, but I've been blown away by some of the wonderful work that's going on behind the scenes in the Australian Defence Force that most Australians probably don't know about. And many of those are reservists, and they're coming in with professional qualifications or trades and skills that are highly desired and highly needed. The challenge for us is how do we attract those people and how do we make sure that they see a future that's a long-term one, either as a reservist or a full-time member of the Australian Defence Force, and a rewarding and fulfilling career. The second element of that, I think, is the family piece and support for families. A lot of Australians now want to make sure that they can live and work close to home, that their partners have access to employment that's close to home, that their kids get access to good education. And that's something that we need to be conscious of in the Australian Defence Force, and about how we make the attractive offering to families as well, because a happy family is a happy Defence Force member as well.
Chief of Reserves of the ADF. First of all, Minister, thank you very much for the focus you have put on people, which I think virtually everybody in this room would agree with. And to follow up the question that Peter Alchemade asked, let me focus on the recruiting system and organisation that we have in Australia. Now, all of us in this room have seen many, many recruiting campaigns. We've seen television advertising. We've seen reorganisations, we've seen restructures, we've seen old contracts, externally new contracts for recruiting, but it's very obvious that more of the same will not do the job to expand the capability of our boutique defence force in this country. So let me ask you, this will need transformational change to compete with industry in Australia, all of the attractive jobs that capable Australians have locally and overseas. Are we up to transformational change in our recruiting system so that we can do away with the concept that you fight your way to get into the army and provide a real service for young Australians? We lose so many people through this process, capable young Australians who can't survive the rigours and above all the time we take to do recruiting. So I invite you to comment on how do we transformationally change our recruiting system in the ADF?
Yeah, very good point, Greg. And it's something that I think that we need to do a better job of. So, for instance, the length of time that it takes to recruit someone to the Australian Defence Force is something that I think we definitely need to look at, particularly in a competitive labour market, or particularly in a case of, say, a kid finishing a trade, finishing a degree, and then applying for the Australian Defence Force and having to wait 6 to 12 months before they get a decision on whether they're going to be accepted or not. In a tight labour market, that's not going to hold up. The kid will go and get another job. And as we know, once you get established in a workforce or a career, it's very hard to drag someone out of that, particularly if they're enjoying it and they're doing well and they're in the early stages of their career. So I think you're right, we need to be conscious of that. The Defence Department's just signed a new contract with Adecco, a new provider, around recruitment. So we're hopeful that there's some innovative ideas that they can bring to that process. But hopefully these are some of the recommendations that will come out of the Reserves Review as well. And I just want to make sure that they are real recommendations, that we can do something about it, not just changing perhaps the wording of an ad that you see on television, but how we can make real difference to that recruitment process.
Thanks, Minister. We might have two more questions. The first from Neil James, just here. Minister, with respect to that as well, the corollary of that as well, of course, is incentivising the space when people leave service category 7 full-time service. Yep. And we'll talk about that as well later today. As you know, people leave for all number of reasons, and but what we often don't do, as well as we might at the moment, is stay in touch with those people once they, by default, go to service category 2 for a period of time. And not everybody remains determined to stay away from their Defence Force full-time service for that 5 years. They might have a change of heart. Yeah. Their civilian work might change. They might acquire new skills in their new civilian role that would be of use to Defence to come back in. So there's space there for us as well. It's the other side of the same coin in terms of boosting the overall capability from the ADF. And of course, there's also a wellbeing dimension to that. Yep. If someone stays connected to the life they knew by way of transitioning from CERCAT 7 full-time service to something else. Yeah. Neil.
Neil James from the Australia Defence Association. Two quick questions. Obviously, the review will have to look at both of them, but my suggestion would be, and I'd be interested in your view on this, two things that could be done immediately. One would be the government saying they have no intention of privatising the Defence Housing Australia, which was a source of great angst in the Defence Force over the last 10 years when the opposite side of politics were in power. And the second one would be looking at the problem of superannuation for reservists. The argument's always been because the pay's tax-free, they can't pay super. Now the only other group in society that weren't paying super, which was our national netball team, now get super. Is it not now time for the Defence Reserves to be included in the national superannuation scheme?
On Defence Housing Australia, I can tell you we have no intention of privatising Defence Housing Australia. It provides a very, very valuable service to the Australian Defence Force. It will be part of the review that's going on into the adequacy of defence housing moving forward. There are some challenges facing Defence Housing Australia, and the board have been very open with the government about that. They're facing some capital challenges moving forward, but thankfully they've identified that and they're putting in place a process to ensure that they can deal with that. And it relates to factors that are contributing to other elements of society, with increasing in building costs, difficulty with planning regulations and things like that. So I'm pretty confident that Defence Housing Australia will get through this difficult period and will stay in government hands. In respect of superannuation, I'd love to be able to tell you that we could announce that here today, but I don't think the Treasurer would be too happy with me. So, but it's something, definitely a good suggestion around superannuation and how we can make that more attractive to reservists, and I'll certainly take that back to the Treasurer and others and discuss it with them.
Thanks, Perhaps to wrap up, one final question. Greg Mellick.
Yep, I know Greg.
Minister, one of the problems is the pay system, the pay tail is wagging the dog, and we have very rigid pay structures within Defence. We require people to go through all sorts of hoops to get to a stage where we really only want them to do one particular job, but they have to have a whole lot of the capability surrounding it. CDF doesn't have the capability to recruit the way which he may want to because of the remuneration tribunal. We should be able to develop a system where CDF, in conjunction with the Minister, has the capacity to say, I need capability X, I reckon it's worth about X dollars, and therefore I want to bring him in and put him in uniform, rather than bring him as a civilian contractor. Has there been any thought given to dismantling the very rigid structures set up by the Remuneration Tribunal?
Something that I think that we could certainly have the capacity to look at through the reserves review. It wasn't a specific recommendation or something that was identified from the Defence Strategic Review, so there's not too much work going into it at the moment. But if you want to make a recommendation to the government, if you want to write to us about it, I'm certainly happy to see what we can do to help facilitate more flexibility. Can I just, on behalf of the government, thank each and every one of you for your wonderful service to our nation. You know, with the Defence Strategic Review recently being released and the heightened tension geopolitically within our region, that the government is committed to ensuring that we have the Australian Defence Force and the capacity to defend our nation into the future, and your service is going to be vitally important to that. So I want to thank you on behalf of the government for your service to our nation, and enjoy the rest of the conference, and thanks for having me. Cheers.